He is very tight with her.
Oh, yeah.
And she's very tight with him. Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Yep. That was 300 people there, man. I don't know.
You wouldn't miss it about offices they come.
I don't know.
He was there so no, he was there to introduce her. All of a sudden, it was pretty funny when they were listening all bash and stuff.
Everybody but you guys.
Yeah, exactly. I ate my salad though. I took a bite of my salad thing and he went on the table and came back and the dude was eating it. And I said, what?
Was it really told?
No, it was in Folsom, at my nice house in Folsom.
He posted it online. Sent me a message.
Like CJ salad.
I don't know his name, some old guy from Sonora.
Let's see a bite. I sit down after a drink, come back and something to my salad.
My congressman was happy to hear what you told me and the district did to me. And
Did you say anything?
No, I just watched it.
great. XOXO.
Is that it's kind of awkward, but it's like the.
Yeah.
No, why don't you some guy own some pizza place?
But he's on some silent thing where Black Ops, he can't see that he's friends with him or something.
Really? How do you do that?
What are you posting?
Matter of fact, I think he does that too, because he told me about some of the posts.
Oh.
Welcome. At this time, we would like to call to order the meeting of the Finance and Audit Committee for the Sacramento Metropolitan Fire District, Thursday, June 28th. And first order of business, roll call.
We have Director Orzali, Director Wood, and Director Kelly.
Yes, thank you. All right, first order of business, public opportunity to discuss matters of public interest within the committee's scope, including items on or not on the agenda. Any speakers hiding? Anybody want to call anybody to come and speak? All right, then, moving on to our consent items. What's your pleasure, gentlemen?
Mr. Chair, I'll move the consent.
We have a motion and a second on the consent items. Seeing no objection, would you please call the roll?
Director Orzali, Director Wood,
Aye.
and Director Kelly.
Aye.
Motion passes.
We've got a lot of time here in between items. Moving on to our presentation items, the financial report through April 30, 2018. Madam CFO, if you would please.
Good evening, directors, Chief Harms. Amanda Thomas, Chief Financial Officer, and I'm here this evening to present the financial report for the 10 months ended April 30th, 2018. So the first chart we're looking at shows the district's cash balance, and this is cash balance in all district-held funds, not just our general fund, which we'll be focusing on for most of the rest of the presentation, but this is all funds. And you can see, looking at the red line, that as of April 30, 2018, we had about $17.6 million in cash. It's a little bit below where we were last year, which is shown on the green line. And the reason for that difference really has to do with the timing of receiving our IGT revenue. So that was received earlier in the prior fiscal year than it was this year, as well as the timing of our equipment financing, which also happened later this year relative to last year. So those two things account for a lower cash balance at this point in the year. This chart shows our general fund reserve. So really what this is showing us is our starting reserve, adding in revenues that we've received throughout the year and subtracting expenses that have been paid throughout the year. And the blue line is showing us our current reserve as of April 30, 2018. compared to where we were last fiscal year, which is the red line there. And that's, again, tracking a little bit lower than we were this point in time last year, largely due to the fact that we haven't had the transfer yet from the IGT fund to the general fund, whereas at this time last year, we had received that transfer. So that's basically accounting for the difference there. The dashed yellow line on this chart shows where we expect our reserves to be at the end of the fiscal year based on budget. So about $21 million, or a little under 11% of net budgeted expenditures. This chart shows our medic cost recovery revenue. If you'll remember from prior months' presentations, this revenue source has been trending below budget for us pretty much all year. You can see by looking at the red line, which shows where we are for the current year, so $27.7 million through April. You can see that the last several months, essentially the second half of the fiscal year, we have been above where we were last year, so above that green line, which is last year's number, but still trending below our budgeted number, which is shown with the blue line of $35.2 million. We do anticipate that we will get closer to the blue line as we complete the year. As I said, the last months have performed better than the earlier months in the fiscal year, but it has taken time for us to see the impact of the rate adjustment that was enacted. This chart is showing total operating revenues. Again, red line showing the current year amount. So we're at $179.7 million through April. The blue line is showing the mid-year budget of $200.7 million. And you can see, looking at the April number, that we're a little below budget, so the red dot being a little bit below the blue dot, and that's really the result of the fact that those medic cost recovery revenues are under budget at this point in the year. You can see that we are exceeding where we were at this time last year, which is shown in the green line. So turning to look at expenses, our salaries and benefits expenses are shown on this chart. The red line, again, showing the current fiscal year, so $136.3 million through April. You can see that that is tracking very closely to the blue budget line. For the year as a whole, we're budgeting for $167.9 million in labor expenditures. And then this chart is showing total expenditures. Again, red line being the current fiscal year, so total expenditures including labor, $162.4 million through April. The blue line is showing the budget, so our total budgeted expenditures for the entire year are $201.7 million, and we are tracking just slightly below that blue line there, largely as a result of our non-labor expenditures being under budget at this point in the year. Finally, this chart is showing the balance in our CERP fund, or our retiree medical trust. You can see that as of the end of April, we had about $33.2 million sitting in that fund, and that was made up of cumulative contributions of $27.7 million and cumulative investment earnings of about $5.5 million. So we have seen some strong investment returns recently in that fund. So in summary, for the 10 months ended April 30th, our general fund revenues and expenditures are both trending slightly below budget through April. On the revenue side, the medic cost recovery revenues continue to lag the budget, but as I mentioned, they have increased in the second half of the fiscal year, so we've seen some improvement there. Our non-labor expenditures are also tracking below budget. So because we have received that second installment of property tax revenues, so we're kind of at the point in the year where we're sort of at the high water mark. Our revenues have exceeded our expenditures by $17 million through April. And that net amount is really right on track with where we would expect to be based on our budget. So essentially the fact that we're under budget in revenues is offset by the amount that we're also under budget in expenditures. So we're right at the net amount that we would have expected. And as we know, our expenses will outpace our revenues for the remaining 2 months of the year because we now have received pretty much the majority of our property tax revenues. So we will be spending more than we're taking in for May and June, which is why we're not projecting that 17 million will hold. In fact, our budget is showing that we'll have about $1 million more in expenses than revenues during the year. That concludes my report, but I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
Any questions from the group?
Mr. Chair, go ahead.
Amanda, would you just go over that last section about the excess in expenses? We're going to be about $1 million over budget. Is that right?
Yes, I'll show you. It's not over budget, but based on our budget, if we go back and look at the reserves chart, I'll show you what I mean. So that's essentially, if you look at this chart, you can see, if you look all the way to the left-hand side, the leftmost dot on July 1 is essentially where we're starting the year in terms of reserves. And if you compare that to the dashed yellow line, that's projecting where we're going to end the year. You can see that the dashed yellow line is slightly below the starting point. And the reason for that is because we are budgeting for a $1 million use of reserves in fiscal year 17-18. So that if you look at the chart down at the bottom, you can see that as of April 30th, our reserves are just under $40 million. So that first column there where it says reserves, net of workers' compensation, the second to last row, just under $40 million as of April. But as of June 30th, what we're projecting is that we'll end the year with the reserves of about $21.5 million. And that's because we will essentially have spent the difference between those two in May and June of this year.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Ms. Thomas, on the SERP fund, just so that nobody forgets, what is that to offset?
So that is for retiree medical premiums.
And do we know the amount that's in that balance on that retiree unfunded liability?
Actually, as we speak, that amount is being updated. But yes, it is north of $100 million.
All right, thanks. I just want to make sure that we know why we have that SERP fund.
Right.
Well, I would hope that our medic cost recovery continues to trend up and that the non-labor expenditures continue to trend down. So thank you for that report. Seeing no further questions from the group, thank you again.
You're welcome.
Next meeting date is scheduled for roughly a month from now, late July on the 26th. Time to be determined, but 5:30 seems to work well. All right. Any anticipated action items from directors to my right? No? All right, then. At this time, we will go ahead and adjourn the meeting and wait around for the next one to start.